Hey, everybody. We are going to be talking about using virtual worlds in a time of travel disruption. I have here with me Aaron Frank, who's a principal faculty here at Singularity University. He's a writer and lecturer based full-time at SU, where he focuses his time researching the use of augmented and virtual reality technologies and their impact on business and society. His writing has been published on Forbes, Wired UK, Vice, VentureBeat, and many, many others as well. Aaron, thanks for joining us today. Let's talk about virtual worlds.
Let's do it. Thanks for having me. So that's my cue to share screen?
Yep, go for it.
Perfect. Okay. I'm going to pull my slides up. And then, so you guys can see this?
Looks good.
Cool. All right. Well, Adam, thank you. And it's great to be here with all of you. I obviously wish I could be in person with you, but given this very extreme moment in time, driving a lot of the discussion over the last 3 days, I know that today is really focused on topics around the future of work, the future of remote collaboration. But before I get started, one thing I do want to say is that many of the themes and topics that I'm going to cover in my session don't really go away as being relevant once our world does return, hopefully soon, back to normal. Remote collaboration is a trend that we're seeing develop quite rapidly. So with that, there's really, I would say, two core categories or themes of what I'd like to talk with you guys about today. The first is really setting some context around, the way augmented and virtual reality exist as a new kind of computing interface. Really, the best way to think of them is that they are new tools for ways that we will interact with computers. And if you think about how often we're interacting with computers today, that's a massive development that we're seeing. And then, of course, really why we're talking here today is how these tools can be used as communication tools, especially for remote collaboration. And so really what I'm calling virtual worlds is really a discussion around, sorry, I have two screens up, so it looks like there's an issue on one side. Adam, just let me know if there's an issue with the slides at all. But I just want to say, so what I'm calling virtual worlds.
Slides look good, Aaron. We've got we see your first slide says working in augmented and virtual reality. Okay,
perfect. Then I've got some other issue on my side screen, but no issues. Very excessive dual monitor situation today. So let's just get into it. So I usually like starting some of the sessions that I teach at Singularity University by showing this picture. So what you're looking at is so this is the entire corporate headquarters. So the only office building of a company that's based in Washington in the United States. And what I usually like to ask people, and I know it's not a lot of information to go from, but based on just looking at this photograph, how many people do you think work at this company? So if you have something to write with, you could write down a number or just keep that number in the back of your head, and we'll come back to this later. But just be thinking about that as we get into it. So if you were to talk to an engineer at a company like Bell Helicopter, they manufacture and design and bring to market helicopters, they would tell you that traditionally, it usually takes somewhere between 5 and 7 years to bring a helicopter to market. It's an incredibly complex task. You have to design software, you have to build test parts, you have to do pilot testing. But just in the last few years, they actually came out with a case study. It was really fascinating that they were able to reduce that timeline down from something that used to take years to something that took months. They reduced, their cost by millions of dollars. They reduced the number of errors. And so one of the questions is, how are they able to do this by using something like virtual reality? And so this leads us to a discussion around the role that virtual reality plays as a new kind of computing interface. Because if you want to understand the history of computing, it's really important to set context about understanding the development of computing interfaces. It used to be true, 70, 80 years ago, that to program a computer, it used to require physically rewiring the device. The programming language, so to speak, was manually connecting wires. It's worth noting that the earliest computer programmers were all women, mostly women. And then what we saw was the development of a new kind of interface. Something called the punch card system came online. Still somewhat of a clunky interface, but it at least saved you from having to physically stick your hand inside the computer. Really, the first real, big breakthrough was the development of the command line. This was the first time that talking to a computer involved just, typing on on a keyboard. You could use words to interact with the machine. And then, as my colleague Jody Medage always likes to point out, the first real mainstream moment of computing interfaces was the graphical user interface. So this was the first time that you could just click on pictures to interact with your computer. And the point that I'd like to make with this sort of history of the development is that at every stage where a new interface came online, the single most important outcome was that it became far easier, far more accessible to work with, and that enabled far more people to work with computers. And so, the graphical user interface was really the first time that we would routinely see our parents or grandparents' generation working with computers. So what are we really talking about with augmented and virtual reality? And I love this article from one of my editors, Jason Dorier, who talks about, this is the great new computing interface that's coming online. In fact, it's so new, we don't really have a good name for it yet. This article's 3 years old now, and it's still somewhat true. We have terms like augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, MR, XR, all of these terms. But really what we're talking about is this idea of what we could refer to as spatial computing. And this is the term that industry insiders are really starting to latch onto. But the big deal with all of these technologies, and it doesn't matter what variation, augmented or virtual reality, is that they all involve the use of three-dimensional space. And that is a really big deal. Again, Jody Medage, my colleague, really likes to talk about this point. She's an interface designer that, the human mind is really a 3D thinking thing. We're born into this world used to moving our limbs in three-dimensional space. It's only as adults where we're asked to learn these, somewhat clunky skills of moving a mouse on a two-dimensional screen and typing on a keyboard to interact with computers. So that brings us back to what it's like in this case as a designer or an engineer working with these new kinds of interfaces. Instead of building a helicopter schematic on a two-dimensional blueprint and working with a design on a two-dimensional flat surface, you can actually just build a CAD file and sit experientially inside the helicopter that you've built in a simulated environment without ever having to have built these test parts. Now, I am focusing at the beginning of this session a bit on platforms that are relevant to engineers and designers, but I will, of course, come to some of the more business relevant interaction and collaboration tools. But at this point, what's really important to note, and I think why we're having this discussion in the context of travel disruption, is that these tools are really becoming foundational collaboration tools to connect people across great distances. So this was an article that came out about how Ford, their engineers and designers, it used to be the case that you had to fly people across the world to get together to collaborate in the same room, in this case, to design and build a car. But at Ford, they now use a platform called Gravity Sketch. So this is one of the available spatial collaboration tools, essentially a virtual and augmented environment where you can design in three-dimensional space. Again, a far more intuitive way of interacting with computers. And this is really transforming the business landscape, but again, in the context of travel disruption, allows people to collaborate across great distances. Now, in a more traditional business context, not specifically for engineers and designers, we're also going to see these kinds of remote collaboration tools. In this case, you can see what that might appear to look like in something like augmented reality. This is a company called Spatial, which really became more well-known within just the last year. Very avatar-based, so they will create an avatar of you based on a photograph, and then with that avatar, you can connect with people in a spatial way in three-dimensional space to do a variety of collaboration. So you can actually do some sophisticated, brainstorming sessions, workshops with colleagues across distance. There are other collaboration tools in the augmented reality space. This is one I think that's really particularly interesting. There's a company called Flow Immersive. And I want to thank Jason Marsh, the CEO and founder, who was nice enough to spend some time with me last week, walking me through some of their latest developments. But really what they're focused on, less on, say, sort of focusing on the idea of creating an avatar and a sense of presence for remote meetings. They're really more focused on, really focusing on the data or the content that's sort of the subject of the meeting itself. So, if you think about the way meetings are conducted today, especially remotely, is a lot of that content is presented on two-dimensional surfaces, not unlike what we're doing here in a webinar setting over the last 3 days. So they're working quite closely with companies like Magic Leap, the headset manufacturer, and other platforms as well. But you can imagine that a three-dimensional, spatial way of interacting with data makes meetings far more engaging, far more interactive, and given the context of where the world's at, they're really trying to position themselves to provide tools for remote teams to collaborate around information, mainly focusing on the data and the data storytelling. So they're interesting and worth checking out. So as an interface, it's worth mentioning that really the big deal is that these are three-dimensional environments, which, from a human cognition standpoint is a really big deal. It's a really big breakthrough in computing interfaces. But what I'd like to talk about now is the way that we'll be using these interfaces to connect and share experiences across distance. So as a researcher who's been really looking at these technologies for almost a decade, it's almost 8 years now. One of the most powerful experiences that I consistently have over time is anytime I can do something online in an immersive virtual environment, in a virtual space with other people, and that's the key, is with other people. So one of the platforms that I became really fascinated with a few years ago, many of you may be familiar with it, but it's called AltSpace. They were acquired by Microsoft, but what AltSpace have been building are ways for people to share experiences online with other people. In AltSpace, I've gone to music festivals, podcast tapings. I can show you exactly what this looks like. So this was actually how I attended the presidential debate a few years ago. What's worth noting, all of the avatars that you see on the screen are people that are at home in their own virtual environment, in their own headset. You can talk to them. The spatial audio is actually quite sophisticated. I met people from all over the world, from different countries, from different parts of the US. And so tools like this will become a way to connect in a more experiential way across great distances. So it's worth mentioning that some of these platforms are also becoming quite sophisticated. A few weeks ago, there was a massive conference event. So this took place over 6 days across a variety of platforms, including AltSpace and another one called Engage, which I'll talk about later. There were, over 150 sessions, I think over 2,000 people, an entirely virtual conference. We're all disappointed that events like South by Southwest are getting canceled. But actually later this week, in a platform called Engage, HTC is running I think a really fascinating experiment, an entire conference event with avatars where you can walk around and engage with other conference attendees. And that's going to be taking place actually tomorrow. And is worth, I'll mention that again at the end. But thinking about these virtual environments, the kinds of remote collaboration that you can do. So this is another platform called Tsunami. Again, kind of similar to something like AltSpace. It's avatar based, but you can work on developing around CAD files. If you're an engineer, a designer, again, no travel required. You can feel as if you're really there, present with other people, developing whatever it is that you're working on. From a practical standpoint, if any of you watching this are wondering, okay, what's the easiest way to get involved? What could I do immediately? It's worth mentioning a platform being developed by Mozilla. It's called Hubs. The reason I mention this one is it's by far the most accessible. That doesn't require a headset. It doesn't require you to download any new software. It's entirely browser-based. So it's, you can just create your own space. I can actually show you, kind of an interesting example. This is one of our partners in South Africa, Mick Mann, and his team with SU South Africa, who using Mozilla Hubs, which is a free-to-use platform, you can see they kind of developed and designed their own custom newsroom. And then, you can kind of see where I'm in my apartment in San Francisco, feeling like I'm hanging out with a journalist doing an interview, kind of a press conference with someone in South Africa, feeling like we're actually there together. And they've done their own custom work on the avatars, so don't be distracted by that. But that's some of the sort of the special ingredient that Mick's team has been doing down in South Africa. Now, at this point, it is worth mentioning, because when I do classroom sessions, I always love asking the question, how many of you have ever at any point had an account on Second Life? And the reason I bring this up is, many of these topics that we're talking about are not entirely new, are not new concepts. Virtual worlds have been around for quite a while. And so I usually get about maybe 10% of hands will go up. I imagine, some of you on watching this that I'm sure must have had an account on Second Life. But I also recognize that the vast majority of you have probably not heard of Second Life. So it's worth noting, just setting some historical context about what we're talking about. Second Life was a massive phenomenon about 15 years ago. The way it worked is you create an account for yourself, and with your account, you build yourself an avatar, and with your avatar, you explore these online virtual worlds. It was, what made Second Life unique is that none of these worlds were built by Second Life. They were built by other users. It was really one of the first examples of real user-generated content. Millions of people were signing up for this. Companies were building entire offices. U2 gave a rock concert at some point in Second Life. And so, this was really the first real sort of, idea or concept around what we're starting to see depicted in concepts like Ready Player One or other forms of science fiction. If anyone's read Snow Crash, the metaverse, these are kind of the earliest concepts of what we're starting to see. It's also worth noting that one of the most fascinating aspects of Second Life was that it was one of the first online platforms to create a virtual economy. They have a currency that is tied to fiat that people can buy real virtual goods and services. And not only does Second Life still exist today, it's still a massive platform. Many people don't realize this, that the in-game economy, the GDP, you could say, of Second Life today is actually larger than some real-world countries. So these virtual worlds are really starting to become a sort of a more mainstream concept. And really what we're seeing today is the development, 15 years later, of what we might refer to as, next generation versions of Second Life or successors to Second Life. And so I've picked a few examples that are more business collaboration focused. But before I get to those, I do want to mention one platform just to demonstrate what we're talking about. So this is a platform called Sansar. It's actually made by Linden Labs, the company that built and owns Second Life. So this is their own newest virtual world concept. So I'll show you exactly what this looks like. So this was a world built by one of their users, a company called Fnatic. They are an esports franchise. So if you're not familiar with esports, it's basically a sports team. They play video games, but a really successful esport franchise. They were one of the first League of Legends world champions. And so this is an online clubhouse that Fnatic has built. And so the person that you see in the middle of the screen there, that's my friend Sam. So that's his avatar. He's based in Los Angeles. You can see me in the bottom right at my apartment in San Francisco. I can hang out with Sam, feel like we're actually there together. What I think is also really fascinating about this example is you can kind of see the earliest version of an online, three-dimensional retail environment. You can actually, go and buy some of this apparel, both for your avatar and in the real world. The point I always like to make with this is, really what you're looking at is the future of the internet. You're really looking at, what a website will look like, at some point in the next decade. In the mid 90s, with the development of the internet, most CEOs of companies would probably have looked at that and said, oh, that's interesting, but I don't know if it's relevant for my business. And now, of course, there's probably not a single, company in the world that doesn't have some kind of a website. And so I would argue that any company that has a website today at some point in the next decade, maybe 15 years if we're pushing it, will have some kind of a virtual world presence like this. And so this is the sort of the earliest version of, and the point being that it's social, it's interactive, and you can feel like you're there with other people. And so, remote interaction and social, our social lives, our professional lives will start to move to these kinds of environments. So let's talk about, just in the few minutes that we have remaining, there's a few business platforms that are really sort of building on some of these concepts. This is a platform that I don't know how accessible it is at the moment, but it is worth checking out. They are based in Europe. It's called Arthur. They came out of Boost, a kind of a prestigious VR accelerator here in Silicon Valley. This is a meeting that I had with one of their founders, Dominic. So he's based in Barcelona. I know it's not a long video, but you can kind of get a sense for the types of attributes that they're building. It's really focused on building business meetings inside of a virtual world that you can interact with other people. So, I would encourage you to kind of keep an eye on this company for that reason. I think they're really focused on, solving issues relevant to business people. And then I'd like to return to this photograph because, usually at this point, I like to ask people, what number did you write down? How many people most of the time, the most common answer is one, obviously. There's probably only one employee. Sometimes people will say five. Really aggressive guesses will say, several thousand. Maybe they have remote workers. But the reality is that this is the entire corporate office. So this is the entire corporate headquarters, the only physical office building of a publicly traded company who, on the first day of their trading on the NASDAQ, their market cap crossed $1 billion, who, as of last count, has more than 27,000 employees around the world. And the entire company is operated inside of an online virtual world, not unlike Second Life, what I just showed a little bit ago. And that is a pretty incredible turning point in the development and use of these kinds of online virtual worlds. This is not some second, Ready Player One science fiction future. This is a company that if you're hired, you do your onboarding, you do your sales trainings, you have your company, quarterly meetings in here. And it's not just so ironically, it is a real estate company. So they are in the business of buying and selling physical assets in the real world. But it's worth noting that the executive team, the entire company, so the CEO is based in Washington. The CTO, when I interviewed him, lives in upstate New York. I know they had a CIO in Reno, Nevada at one point. But this is a fully remote company that operates their entire business from inside an online virtual world. So, and I'll come back to the software they use to do that. It's called Verbella. But Verbella is now becoming, used in other environments as well. This is Stanford's business school now conducts entire classes in a similar campus. So really becoming useful. So I'll leave you with just a few resources. This was an article that came out just a few days ago from Charlie Fink, a really great commentator who's worth following in this space. The title might suggest that it's more about events, but he actually covers quite a few of the collaboration tools. So really worth checking out. And then this one, Ben Lang from Road to VR. He's a great Twitter follow, really insightful, and I really appreciate it. So he put together a list. It's basically just a list of all of the platforms. I wasn't familiar with some of them on this list. So, really hats off to Ben. This was a really useful article that we can make available. And thanks to Krista Pauly and Riley Florence for pointing this article out to me. And then if you were to ask me, okay, so what is the tangible next step that I could do if I want to actually participate in this and not just learn about it? The thing that I would argue is probably the easiest thing you could do immediately is to download Verbella's Open Campus. So this is the software that's used by the real estate company that I just talked about. And so within the last year, they have made available a fully sort of free to use version of their campus. You could think of it as like a virtual public space, a public park almost. Anyone can download it. Anyone can create an avatar. You can host meetings in the space. It's, so at Singularity University, I've experimented with hosting learning programs. We're, rapidly exploring whether, we could move some of what we do as a learning company inside platforms like this. But anyone can use it. You can use the infrastructure to host your own business meetings, and you can do this today. And it is worth noting, while I would never want to encourage anyone to leave this great webinar at noon later today, if it's more worth your time, they will actually be hosting a session with their CEO about how they run that real estate company. But the nice thing about being online is you could probably do both. You could have our webinar open at the same time and kind of check it out, but maybe an incentive to download the software and use it. And then finally, these are, again, some of the platforms. Engage, I guess I didn't come back to. I said I would, but they're worth checking out because they're hosting a massive conference tomorrow, which would be a really fascinating experiment that I'm very curious to learn more about. And then finally, I will leave my contact information. I'm more than happy to try and get back if anyone has any follow-up questions. I'll try and be diligent about responding to everyone. Happy to be a resource, answer questions, provide insights as needed or helpful. But with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and check back in with you, Adam.
Thanks, Aaron. Well, judging by the chat and the engagement there, I think you're going to get a lot of emails after this. So
Cool.
Hope you're ready to go through that inbox.
I'm ready. I'm quarantined, shelter at home. So I got nothing else to do, and I'd be more than happy to.
There you go. Well, everybody, if you've got, we're going to get through some questions right now, but if we don't get to your question, by all means, follow up with Aaron. And Aaron, maybe what we can do is some of the questions that come through, let's create a follow-up resource that we can share with people as well.
For sure.
All right, cool. First top question. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening with augmented reality in healthcare right now?
Yeah. So at the moment, I would say that the most relevant application, and this is true across, so if people in other industries have the same question, but in healthcare in particular, it's really being used, not, I wouldn't say primarily, but very heavily as a training tool. So, hospital workers that, or surgeons, there's a company called Also VR, which is definitely worth checking out. That's basically training surgeons in a simulated environment how to do surgeries before you go inside a body. There's been some experiments with deploying head-worn glasses, like Google Glass tried this quite a while ago, and they've redeployed a new headset, an enterprise edition, inside hospital systems to do hands-free care. Those haven't really become quite ubiquitous or mainstream at the moment, but fairly soon you'll have these kind of hands-free, head-mounted AR systems that can provide real-time information, heads-up display, almost what we associate with video games, where you can read vital signs. I can offline. I'm happy to connect with whoever asked the question and point you in the direction of some of the companies doing that. But I would say in healthcare, what's true of both augmented and virtual reality is that as a training tool, it's really being used to sort of train in a more intuitive way. And yeah, just the one company that comes to mind that I've been tracking, and I know Daniel Kraft is a great resource on this as well. But also VR, OSSO, is worth checking out.
Right on. Thank you. Okay, next popular question, which I think comes up in every single one of your talks. If the audience could buy one piece of virtual reality equipment today, what should they get?
You know what? That's a great question. And as of like maybe 6 months ago, I'd have a hard time answering it, but I'm fully sold that the only answer to that question is the Oculus Quest. I as an early adopter, I had one of the early Rifts, just to put into context. So I have an Oculus Rift that's PC based. It's, very expensive, it was a work expense. Okay. So, but I have, it's a gaming PC. There's wires everywhere. It's probably a $2,000 investment. This was in 2016. I had to convince one of my roommates to switch rooms with me because I didn't have enough physical space at the apartment I was living in just to use it at that point. But now, so all of that same functionality, all of the hand tracking is done inside the device itself. So the Oculus Quest, it's a standalone device. It's made by Oculus. At this point, it's probably the most popular device on the market. But from an engineering standpoint, it's really well designed. It's not perfect. The processing power is still, leaves a little bit to be desired. You can't run things like Sansar, which I just showed you, as of today in something like the Quest. But for the most part, and the most important thing is the hand tracking, the fact that it can it can sense its environment around you, and I can put it in a shopping bag and I can take it to my friend's house because it's just the headset. And I should mention that it's like 5 times less than the Rift would have been like 4 years ago. So it's like a fifth of the cost, the same functionality, and you can do everything that you could have done, 5 years ago. And that, I think, demonstrates that exponential improvement in these technologies. But yeah, hands down, I always recommend the Oculus Quest is the most versatile piece of equipment on the market.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Jose asks, why are we not using VR for this online conference? Are 20,000 people too many? Jose, I'm going to answer that first, and I'll let Aaron chime in. First off, I don't know if you guys know this, but we put this thing together in less than 2 weeks. The other thing was that if we went to full VR, we'd somehow have to figure out how to get 20,000 people access to a headset. But I do have a poll down there. If you are interested in doing something like that with us, respond to that poll. That could be something that we pull together in the next couple weeks and months. But Aaron, what's the largest VR event that you've seen so far?
Well, it depends how you measure it. And this is, so depends how you measure it. But in true VR, like immersive VR in a headset, there's a company that I know still exists. So the company's called High Fidelity. I didn't talk about them in my presentation because they're going through a bit of a transition moment. And they will, I think, become very relevant in this topic of remote collaboration. But one of the things they were doing is around load testing. I think I participated in one that I think had like 600 or 700 people, which in one virtual space is from an engineering standpoint, like unbelievably impressive, because these are people in full immersive headsets. the company Verbella that I mentioned, they've done conferences. The thing that makes Verbella really interesting is that it's a way more accessible platform. It doesn't require a headset. It can work on a laptop. They've had events that have had thousands, or I want to say around 1,000, I think at most, that I've not participated in. But arguably the largest VR event that I did participate in, depending how you define it, was the Fortnite concert with Marshmello about a year ago, which I would qualify as a virtual event. So I'm sure many of you are familiar, the video game Fortnite, about a year ago, they hosted a concert with Marshmello, one of the most famous DJs on the planet. And the numbers that came out from that was that 10 million people from around the world, basically from their virtual world, which is, it's an Xbox game, but I think qualifies in this sense. And I think, and I can point, actually, Matthew Ball is a VC who has written extensively about how Fortnite as a virtual world actually points the direction to where the future of our VR sort of virtual environments are headed from a, not just gaming standpoint, a recreational standpoint, but from professional world, our recreational lives, our social lives. I forget that it's called The Metaverse by Matthew Ball, but it's a really great article. I would recommend that as a great resource to sort of understand how Fortnite puts into context the way we should be thinking about where this all might be going.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a good reminder of stuff that we talk about here, where it's like, you've got this progression, right? And just like we had some technical difficulties getting started here with just people joining one platform to watch a live video stream all at once, there's these different levels of, I think, platforms when it comes to different engagement and fidelity, right? When you're in full VR, we're still struggling to get a couple hundred people together. But then you've got a video game company like Fortnite that is able to get millions of people on the platform at the same time. It's like, how do we get these crossovers happening between different industries and use cases?
Yeah. I'm also a little distracted because there's someone in the comments that said it's not an Xbox game, and they are right. It is available on all platforms. And Frank Shaw just posted the link to the article that I was mentioning. So sorry, the posters are awesome. But yes, I was a little distracted from your point, so I apologize.
No, it's all right. It's all right. Let's talk about, I think we've got time for maybe one or two more. This question that comes in from Mark. How could something like VR help with the social isolation that some people might be feeling right now?
Oh, that's a great question. So one of the big debates that comes up often is around this idea of, should we be concerned about people moving into these virtual environments in a way that's, antisocial or harmful to society? And people have visions of something like WALL-E, for example, which, given themes or, issues we've seen around things like, internet addiction, that is a valid concern. But at the same time, if you look at the way that's, for example, Second Life. So I mentioned that Second Life is still quite popular and used today. If you look at some of the subcultures or sort of aspects of the communities that form in Second Life, it's actually a really fascinating sort of application area. So in Second Life, there are, for example, there's one user who runs not a clinic, but sort of a social online community for Parkinson's patients. So these are patients that are usually, unable to go outside to, interact with other people, that, they have some form of debilitation. And in Second Life, in an embodied way with their avatar, they can go, horseback riding, they go, ballroom dancing, they, do ice skating, all these activities that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. I forget what year it was, but The Atlantic ran a couple years ago a really interesting long form article about Second Life, and this was like the core topic of what, the question was, why is Second Life still around and how is it used? And the answer, interestingly, was basically addressing what the person who just asked this question is bringing up, the idea that people that, so it's, in this case, Second Life is not an escape from reality. For most of the users, I don't say most of the users, from a significant number of the users that still participate in Second Life, it's not an escape from reality. It's a way to access things that they couldn't otherwise do in the real world. And so it sort of enhances and it provides access to sort of social resources that are unavailable to them. And so in that sense, there is an opportunity to use all of these worlds in a pro-social way that, connects people in a healthy way that provides access to experiences, whether it's patients that or if it's end of life care, people that want to experience going on a tour of Athens, or see go swimming with a great white in the Great Barrier Reef, or something like this, that experiences that you otherwise can't have with other people. There's an opportunity to build these systems in a way that is aligned with the best parts of a social way of living that we should aspire to.
Couldn't have said it better. Aaron, that takes us to our time today, but thank you for joining us. You're on Twitter, yeah?
I'm a Twitter user. I'm on Twitter. Feel free to follow. I don't post often.
If people have questions for you, can they tweet at you right now?
Yeah, but I'll just give him my email. But for sure.
All right. We'll put in, if you want to get in touch with Aaron, get him on email. Don't tweet at him. But you can also
tweet at me. It makes me feel good.
There you go. Or tweet it at SingularityU. Tag us, and we'll see if we can get some questions answered on there as well. But Aaron, thank you for joining us today. Clearly insightful and interesting topic for our audience, and we look forward to doing more with you.
Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
All right. See you, man.
See you later.
Okay. Thanks for all the engagement. Gosh, I love seeing the chat in this session. Clearly, y'all were engaged. I appreciate everybody coming in and sharing resources and links and their knowledge. Super cool to see this community come together and collaborate. So next, we are going to talk to Charlene Lee, who's going to be talking about 5 ways your leadership must change to thrive with remote work. And since a lot of us are at home now, maybe some of you, well, a lot of you probably for the first time, the next couple sessions are going to cover remote work. Hopefully give you some practical tips on how to manage all this change and transition that's going on. Singularity team, can you drop in those links and I'll run through them real quick. We've got our Facebook group. Oh, boom, right on cue. Resources that have come up and have been shared. We'll try to get all these links into that page as soon as possible. But that's the first link. Facebook group, if you want to join us, keep the conversation going. Maybe we'll be able to pull Aaron into that as well. YouTube playlist. If you want to watch any of the previous sessions, are on there. You can also watch it here in Crowdcast, but if you need subtitles, highly recommend going out and checking YouTube. If anybody has any issues with connection, you can always drop off of Crowdcast, go hop over to Twitter or Facebook, where we're streaming it live as well. And of course, go and contribute your ideas to the challenges. But before we go, I asked you, would you attend a virtual summit entirely in VR? Meaning, would you wear a headset, like full virtual, not just avatar, moving around? And we got 68% of you that said yes. 27% of you said no, you don't have a headset, you can't get one. And then everybody else was kind of not interested or not quite sure yet. So looks like overwhelmingly yes, which means I'm going to find a way to do an entirely VR, put on the headset, go and make it happen. So stay tuned for that from Singularity. All right. And with that, I'm going to shut us down and hop to the next session. I'll see you guys back here in a couple minutes.